Most vegetables are 70 to 95% water, so that means watering your garden is a really important task. But it's easy to overwater your garden, so today we're going to talk about how much and when to water. The first thing to know is that everything that we talk about today is really dependent on your particular garden, where it's located, how much sun it gets, if it's at a windy site, and if you have sandy soil or clay soil or something in between. So my recommendation is to take the things that we talk about and experiment in your own garden and see what works for you. Number one, water as efficiently as possible. The most efficient way to water is drip irrigation. It saves you time, it saves you water, and then it delivers the water right where the plants need it most, which is at the roots. But most gardeners I know, including me, don't have drip irrigation set up. It's a little bit costly and takes some time to figure it out. But it is really great if you live in an area where that gets really dry over the summer, because then you'll be able to leave your garden for weeks at a time and not worry about how much rain you're getting. If you don't have drip irrigation, the next best way to water your plants is to water at the base of the plant. So remember, we're watering the soil and the roots, not the actual plants. It's not the best idea to set up an overhead or an oscillating sprinkler and then just walk away from your garden. Overhead watering is inefficient because a lot of the water is lost to evaporation. And some plants, like tomatoes and the squashes, really don't like to have wet leaves, so you can cause a little bit more fungal disease than you ordinarily would if you water at the base of the plants. I use a hose with a wand and hold it at the base of each plant for somewhere between 30 seconds and a minute. I judge when to stop watering when the water starts to pool up around the plants and isn't sucked in really quickly. The other way that you can try to figure out if you're watering enough is to take a trowel and dig in near the side of your plant really gently and try to figure out how far down is the water going. You want it to go down about a foot into the soil. In general, perennial and vegetable plants need about 1 inch of water per week. This all depends on what kind of soil you have. If you have really sandy soil that doesn't hold a lot of moisture, you might have to water a little bit more. Or if you have clay soil like me, your soil should hold the water from the last rain pretty nicely. I've learned over the years that I have no idea how much it rains when it rains overnight. There's times where it's rained all night long, and then I get up in the morning and I think it's got to be at least 1 inch, and then I check my rain gauge and it's only 1/10 of an inch. So that's why I recommend putting some kind of rain gauge in your garden so that you have a visual record of how much water you're getting each time it rains. I usually make a mental note, and then on Sunday night, if I haven't gotten 1 inch of rain, then I'll water my garden. If I have gotten close to 1 inch of rain, sometimes I'll choose not to water at all that week. Number 3 is water established plants deeply and less frequently. You want nice and deeply rooted plants. So one of the ways to do that is to water really deeply, not just on the surface of the soil. So in my garden, I usually water less and just try to water as deep as possible. I like to let the water really soak into the soil to encourage the plant's roots to go as deep as possible. Again, if you want to see how far the water is penetrating into your soil, you can grab a trowel and pull aside some soil to see how far down it's moist after you water. Water newly seeded vegetables lightly and frequently. If you're waiting for seeds to germinate, watering once a week is not going to be enough. You need to keep the top of the soil moist until the seeds germinate. Depending on the vegetable and the weather, I usually give the bed a quick soak either once or twice a day if it's hot. I'll often just use a watering can for this task. I keep a full one near my beds where I'm waiting for seeds to germinate, and I like to use a metal watering can instead of a plastic one because I found that they last a lot longer than the plastic ones. Remember that the various vegetables take differing amounts of time to germinate. Spring radishes can germinate in as little as 7 days, where on the other end of the spectrum are carrots that can take up to 3 weeks to germinate. Both need to be kept consistently moist until those first leaves break through the soil. Number 5, water in the morning or the evening. Much more water is lost to evaporation when you water your garden in the middle of a hot afternoon. Water your garden in the cooler morning or evening hours, and plus, that's a lot nicer time to be out in your garden anyway. During a hot afternoon, you may notice that your plants wilt a little bit. Plants keep themselves cool by releasing water through their leaves, which is called transpiration. During periods of extremely hot weather, plants can lose more water through transpiration than they can keep up with taking up through their roots. That's why sometimes plants wilt on a really hot day, even if there's adequate soil moisture. If water is available in the soil, then the plants will recover during the cooler mornings and evenings. But they might wilt again if there's another hot afternoon. Just make sure your soil has enough moisture to allow those plants to recover in the evenings. And lastly, mulch, mulch, mulch. We've talked about this before, and you know I'm a big proponent of mulching your garden because bare soil is pretty much always a bad idea in the vegetable garden. It's an invitation for a lot more weeds to grow, and your soil will dry out more quickly, sometimes even cracking if it gets too dry. Mulching thickly with hay, straw, or leaves retains your soil moisture. It breaks down and adds organic matter to your soil, keeps the weeds at bay, and can also cut down on disease issues by preventing the soil from washing and splashing up onto the leaves when it rains. This season, make sure you examine your watering habits and see how you're doing. Is there some room for improvement? You want to make sure you're not watering too little because you want your plants to be healthy and to have lots of soil moisture so that they can grow. You also want your seeds to be able to germinate. But you don't want to water too much because you don't want waterlogged soil because roots need some air pockets in the soil and we don't want to fill that all up with water. And there are some vegetables like tomatoes and squash that like to be on the dry side and don't need to be consistently wet. So it's okay to let established plants and garden beds dry out a little bit between waterings. You just don't want it to get bone dry so that your plants start to get stressed. So again, do some experimentation in your own garden with your own soil on your own site and see what works for you. If I had to pick one from this list, even though we talked about it last, I would probably put mulch as number one. It's one of the easiest ways to help your soil retain soil moisture and cut down on the amount of watering you have to do. So good luck, keep me posted, and keep that garden watered.